Laura Miller was a 45-year-old woman living in New York City. Since she was young, she had dreamed of becoming a writer. The books she read as a high school student painted vivid pictures of adventurous journeys, romantic love, and resilient struggles. She always believed that one day, she would write her own stories that could make others feel understood, experience what she had gone through. However, life wasn't always as she had imagined. After graduating college with a degree in marketing, Laura quickly landed a job at a large company. The work was stable, the salary was good, but something inside her always felt incomplete. Her years working in marketing had made her an expert at creating impressive advertising campaigns, but they had also taken her further away from the writing dream she had cherished since childhood. Laura had convinced herself that she could endure, that she could keep going in this career. But every morning when she woke up, she felt exhausted. Sometimes, she would ask herself if this was how she would live her entire life. Could she continue walking down this path without ever challenging herself, without ever doing what she truly loved? The moment Laura could never forget was when she received an email from an old friend, Emily, a successful writer. Emily invited her to a book discussion and writing session. After that meeting, Laura couldn't stop thinking about what Emily had shared. She realized that she couldn't keep living this way if she didn't at least try to step outside her safe bubble. With a mixture of anxiety and excitement, Laura began contemplating the idea of quitting her stable job to pursue her writing dreams. She no longer wanted to spend her life sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day without knowing if she was truly living the life she wanted. But how could she possibly leave a steady job and start over from scratch? Laura sat in her apartment, staring at the empty page on her laptop screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no words came. The silence was deafening, filled with the weight of the decision she knew was coming. She had spent the past few days contemplating it, the decision that would change her life forever. Could she really do it? Could she truly leave her stable career behind to chase a dream that seemed so distant, so uncertain? She thought back to the conversation with Emily. Emily had made it sound so simple, so natural. "You just have to take the leap," she had said, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Life's too short to keep wondering what if." Laura had listened intently, but in the back of her mind, there was a constant voice saying, "What about the bills? What about the security you've worked so hard for?" That was the hardest part. The security. At 45, Laura had built a life, a career, a home, a routine. But, in the quiet moments, she began to realize that all of it, her corporate job, the office meetings, the endless emails, had become suffocating. She had built walls around herself, walls that kept her safe but also isolated. The dreams of being a writer were now a distant memory, buried beneath the weight of her responsibilities and fears. "Maybe I'm too old for this," she thought as she clicked on the job offer she had received a few days ago. It was an easy decision, or so she had convinced herself, a senior position in a new marketing firm. More money, more stability, more of the same. But then her mind drifted back to her books, the novels, short stories, the idea of creating worlds with her words. She could still feel the excitement she had once had as a teenager, curled up with her first journal, writing about everything she imagined. That spark hadn't died, it had just been buried under years of daily grind. It was still there, waiting to be reignited. Her eyes scanned the job offer one more time. It felt like a safe route, but also the end of something. The end of her chance to follow what she had truly wanted. Laura closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The walls of her apartment felt suddenly smaller, as if the space around her was pressing in. She could hear her own heartbeat, the rhythm of uncertainty, the quiet whisper of fear, and, underneath it all, a small but insistent voice that said, "Do it." She didn't want to wake up one day and regret not trying. She didn't want to look back at her life in 10 years and wonder if she had made the right choice. She had spent too long living for others, for expectations, for stability. But now, she was ready to live for herself. With one final sigh, Laura reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed the number for her boss. It felt like the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was also the easiest. It was the decision that had been brewing inside her for years, now finally surfacing. "Hello, Mr. Parker." Her voice was steady, but her heart raced. "I've made my decision." It had been 2 weeks since Laura had handed in her resignation letter. The weight of her decision was still fresh on her shoulders, but there was a strange sense of freedom that came with it, too. Each morning now, instead of rushing to a corporate office, she woke up slowly, made her coffee, and sat down at her desk. She had the entire day ahead of her. A blank canvas. But what would she write? The idea of writing had always been intimidating to her. It wasn't the process of putting words on paper, it was the fear of whether those words would matter. Would anyone read them? Would they understand the stories she wanted to tell? And even more pressing, could she do this, full-time, for a living? The first few days felt like a haze. She spent hours staring at her computer screen, checking her email out of habit, scrolling mindlessly through social media, and organizing her files, anything except writing. She'd think of a story, a scene, but then doubt would creep in, and she'd delete it. But after a few days, Laura realized that if she didn't start somewhere, she would be stuck in the same place forever. She needed to write something. Anything. She had to begin the journey, no matter how small. She opened a blank document and let her fingers rest on the keys. The cursor blinked in front of her, waiting for action. She had 1,000 ideas, but no direction. What story would she tell? What experience was worth sharing? Then, she thought about herself. She had spent so many years hiding her true passions, burying her dreams under the weight of responsibilities and expectations. What if she wrote about that? About finding the courage to change, to step into the unknown after years of living in the safety of predictability? She began to type. I was always the dependable one. The one who knew what to do, what was expected of her, and where she was going. But there was a secret longing inside me, one that I didn't understand at the time. A longing to create something, to build something from scratch, to finally live for me. And then, one day, I realized that if I didn't change, I would never know what could have been. Laura paused. The words felt raw, personal, but they were true. It wasn't the perfect story, but it was a start. The beginning of something that had been bubbling inside her for years. She leaned back in her chair and read the paragraph over and over again. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she felt proud of what she had written. That night, as she sat down to dinner with a glass of wine, Laura reflected on the day. She had written. She had actually written. And though it was just a small step, it was a step forward. A step into a new world, her world. The next day, Laura woke up early and continued where she left off. As she wrote, she found herself diving deeper into the story. The characters began to take shape, and the plot unfolded naturally. She wrote about a woman who, like herself, was searching for a way to reinvent her life. The first story she wrote was a reflection of her own journey. She wrote about starting over, about finding the courage to take risks, and about embracing the unknown. And as she did, she realized that this wasn't just a story. It was her story. As Laura's first short story began to take shape, she felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. For the first time in years, she was doing what she had always wanted to do. Writing, not just for herself, but for the world to see. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. In this chapter, Laura finds the courage to begin writing again. She confronts her fears and doubts, and starts to pen her first story, one that is deeply personal and mirrors her own life changes. It's a small victory, but an important one that will set the tone for her future as a writer. Laura sat at her desk, surrounded by empty coffee cups and scribbled notes. The short stories she had written in the past weeks were good, she thought. They felt like a small victory, a confirmation that she could indeed write. But as the weeks went by, a new challenge loomed ahead. She had to write a novel. The idea of writing a full-length book had both excited and terrified her. A novel was a different beast altogether. It was longer, more complex, and required more sustained effort. But it was what she had always dreamed of. She couldn't back away from it now. The fear of failure, which had once paralyzed her, had slowly started to lose its power over her. If she could take the leap into leaving her job, surely she could take the leap into writing a book. She opened a new document, the blank page staring back at her. What would the novel be about? She had ideas, fragments of stories that she had carried around in her head for years. But now, she needed to bring them to life in a way that would captivate readers. It needed a story arc, depth, conflict, and resolution. Maybe I should write about a woman starting over, Laura mused aloud. It felt familiar, too familiar, but it was also the story she understood most intimately. A woman in her 40s, lost in the routine of life, decides to make a drastic change. The idea of starting anew, of breaking free from the chains of the past, had been Laura's own personal journey. She began writing, slowly at first, then faster as the words began to flow. The protagonist, Sarah, was a woman in her 40s who had been stuck in a corporate job for years, just like Laura had been. She was unhappily married, worn out by the demands of daily life, and felt disconnected from herself. One day, she simply decided to leave. She left her marriage, her job, and everything that had held her back. Sarah's story would follow her transformation, her struggles, her joys, and her path toward rediscovering herself. Laura found herself deeply immersed in Sarah's world. The character's challenges mirrored her own in many ways, but it was also an escape. Sarah could do things that Laura had only dreamed of. Sarah could make bold decisions, take risks, and embrace the unknown without fear. Laura was living vicariously through her. Days turned into weeks, and Laura made steady progress. She'd wake up early, drink her coffee, and write for hours, losing track of time. Some days the words came easily, others not so much. But the important part was that she was writing. Each word, each sentence, each chapter brought her closer to her goal. But the doubts started creeping in again. Was the novel any good? Would anyone want to read it? Would anyone care about Sarah's story? Laura had always been her own harshest critic, and now, facing the daunting task of writing an entire book, she was more critical than ever. One afternoon, feeling particularly unsure about her progress, Laura decided to reach out to Emily. She needed advice. She needed reassurance. Emily listened patiently as Laura poured out her worries. What if it's not good enough? Laura asked. What if it doesn't live up to what I imagined? You're doing it, Laura, Emily said, her voice warm and encouraging. You're writing. That's the hardest part. The rest will come. And if you believe in your story, others will too. Keep going, one word at a time. The book isn't going to write itself. You're closer than you think. That was the moment when Laura truly understood what Emily had meant. The fear of imperfection would never go away, but she couldn't let it stop her. Writing was about progression, not perfection. She just had to keep going, no matter how messy it seemed. The next day, Laura sat at her desk with renewed determination. The first draft of her novel was far from perfect, but it was hers. She had created a world, built characters, and explored themes that mattered to her. She was telling her own story through Sarah's journey. By the end of the month, the first draft was complete. After completing the first draft of her novel, Laura felt both exhausted and exhilarated. There was a sense of accomplishment, but also a deep uncertainty. She had poured her heart and soul into Sarah's story, but now came the hardest part: editing, revising, and, most importantly, sharing her work with others. It was one thing to write in solitude, to let the words flow without judgment. It was another thing entirely to let someone else see her vulnerabilities laid bare on the page. For the first time since she had started this journey, Laura felt the weight of doubt pressing heavily on her chest. What if her story wasn't good enough? What if she had wasted all that time and energy for nothing? But Emily's words echoed in her mind. You're doing it, Laura. You're writing. That's the hardest part. With that in mind, she forced herself to take the next step. She reached out to the writing group Emily had introduced her to a few months ago, an online community of writers from all over the world, each at different stages of their own creative processes. It wasn't easy for Laura to share her work with strangers, but she needed feedback. She needed to know if she was on the right track. The response she received was overwhelming. At first, it was intimidating. She had expected some criticism, but the level of detail and honesty in the feedback was unlike anything she had encountered before. The group were supportive, but they didn't pull punches. They highlighted areas where her writing could be stronger, where her characters needed more depth, and where the pacing was off. But they also praised her for the emotion in the story, the rawness of Sarah's journey. One member of the group, Rachel, a fellow novelist who had been writing for years, reached out to Laura directly after reading her first chapter. Rachel had a reputation for being a tough critic, and Laura wasn't sure how she'd feel about the feedback. But when Rachel's email came through, it wasn't filled with the harsh critique Laura had braced herself for. Instead, it was filled with encouragement. I can see the heart in this story, Rachel wrote. It's raw, real, and I think you've got something special here. You've got to keep going. But let's work on making the dialogue stronger and tightening the plot in the middle section. I'd love to help you with the next draft if you're open to it. That was the moment everything changed for Laura. She had found a community of writers who understood what it was like to be at the beginning stages of something bigger than themselves. People who weren't just there to point out flaws but to offer their help, their experience, and their own stories. As the weeks went by, Laura continued to revise her manuscript, often working late into the night. With Rachel's help, she began to see her story in a new light, how the dialogue could feel more natural, how the pacing could build tension, and how to develop Sarah's character into someone readers would care about. Each time Laura hit a roadblock, she would reach out to Rachel or another member of the group for advice, and they would offer new perspectives, new solutions. It was a collaborative effort, and Laura slowly began to feel less alone in her writing journey. But the most significant change wasn't in her novel, it was in Laura herself. As she connected with other writers, she began to realize how important relationships were, not just in writing, but in life. For so long, she had kept herself isolated, focusing only on work and trying to follow a prescribed path. But through writing, she had found a community. Through sharing her story, she had discovered that vulnerability could lead to connection, to support, and to growth. Laura also rekindled relationships with old friends, people she had lost touch with over the years. She began to see her own life differently, as a web of connections, some old, some new, but all valuable. The more she reached out to others, the more she realized how much she had neglected these relationships in the pursuit of career success. She spent more time with Emily, exchanging ideas and learning about the writing world from someone who had already walked the path. She reconnected with her family, finding new ways to be present with them, sharing her writing journey with them, and letting them in on the process. Her relationships with those around her, whether friends, fellow writers, or family, began to transform. She had started this journey feeling alone, but she was discovering that, in order to truly grow, she needed the support of others. Writing was no longer just an individual pursuit, it was a shared experience, one that was deepened by the people around her. In this chapter, Laura learns the importance of relationships, both professional and personal, in her writing journey. Through feedback from the writing group and her deepening connections with friends and family, she discovers that her growth as a writer and as a person is influenced by the people she surrounds herself with. The chapter emphasizes that success isn't just about solitary effort, it's about the community that supports and challenges you along the way. The first day the email came, Laura couldn't believe it. She had spent months revising her manuscript, poring over each word, every sentence, until she thought her eyes would blur from the effort. After submitting her final draft to several publishers and literary agents, she had pushed the thought to the back of her mind. It was an act of faith, of hope that the right person, the right agent, would see something in her work. But then, that email arrived. Dear Ms. Miller, we are pleased to inform you that we would like to offer you a publishing contract for your manuscript, starting over. Her fingers trembled as she read the email over and over again. A publishing contract. She had made it. It wasn't just a dream anymore. Someone who had the experience and expertise in the industry, had read her novel and believed it was worthy of publication. She sat back in her chair, her heart racing. The email was full of terms, deadlines, and expectations, but Laura could barely focus on the details. The words swirled around her head in a daze. Starting over would be a real book. It would be on store shelves. It would be for sale, available for the world to read. And she would be a published author. She immediately picked up the phone and called Emily. Hello? I did it, Laura said, her voice shaking with excitement. I got the contract. They want to publish my book. There was a long pause on the other end, and then Emily let out a joyful laugh. I knew it. I knew you could do it, Laura. You've worked so hard for this. You've earned it. The next few weeks were a blur. Laura worked closely with her editor, fine-tuning the manuscript for publication. The process was grueling at times, as they worked to refine the structure, clarify the character arcs, and make sure the pacing flowed smoothly. It was a collaboration that challenged Laura's confidence, but also reinforced her belief in her story. The editor, a woman named Diane, was kind but firm, guiding Laura through the process of making the book the best it could be. But amid the revisions and late nights, Laura found herself grappling with something unexpected. As much as she had dreamed of this moment, as much as she had longed for the validation of being published, she found herself feeling anxious. What if people didn't like her book? What if they criticized Sarah's journey or didn't connect with the story? The fear of judgment was real, and it weighed on her. She had spent so many years in a corporate job, hiding her true self behind a professional mask, that the idea of opening herself up to the world, of sharing something so personal, was terrifying. One evening, as she sat in her living room, looking over the final edits of her manuscript, Laura's phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel, the fellow novelist she had connected with during her writing journey. "I'm so proud of you, Laura. You've come so far. But remember, your story matters, no matter what anyone says. Don't let fear stop you. The world needs your voice." Rachel's words resonated deeply with Laura. This wasn't just about the book anymore. It was about standing tall in her truth, about embracing her vulnerability and letting it shine through her work. She had already won, she realized. The journey itself, the decision to leave her safe, predictable life and follow her passion, was her success. Getting the publishing contract was just the icing on the cake. As the launch date approached, the excitement grew. Laura started to share her journey with her friends and family, talking openly about the process, the highs and lows, and how much this book meant to her. She was met with support, love, and a deep sense of pride from those who had witnessed her transformation. The day the book was officially released, Laura stood in a small local bookstore, holding a copy of Starting Over in her hands. The cover, designed beautifully, stared back at her. Her name was printed in bold letters across the front. She ran her fingers over the cover, feeling the texture of the pages, the weight of her accomplishment. This was real. She had done it. She had turned her dream into reality. The days following the release of Starting Over were a whirlwind. Laura's book was available in bookstores, on Amazon, and in libraries across the country. She received messages and emails from readers, some praising her writing, others sharing their personal stories of transformation. Every time she checked her inbox, there was a new comment or review. Most of them were positive, but some, like the one she saw on Goodreads, left her feeling vulnerable. "While the story is relatable, it lacks depth in character development," one reviewer wrote. "The plot feels too predictable, and I wasn't fully engaged with Sarah's journey." Laura stared at the screen, feeling a tightening in her chest. She had anticipated some criticism. After all, no book could please everyone. But reading those words hit harder than she had expected. She had worked so hard on this book, invested so much of herself into Sarah's story, and now there were people who didn't understand it, who didn't connect with it the way she had hoped. She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair. Her apartment felt different now. There was a sense of distance, of detachment, between the Laura who had written the book and the Laura who was living through its success. She had been so focused on getting published, on achieving the external goal, that she hadn't fully prepared for what came after. What did success mean if she couldn't enjoy it? What did it mean if the world wasn't as welcoming as she had imagined? In the following weeks, the anxiety about the reviews continued to hover over her. She began to notice how often her mind would drift to the negative comments, how they stuck in her mind like stubborn splinters. She tried to focus on the positive feedback, but it was hard to shake the doubt that lingered. One evening, after a particularly tough day, she called Emily. "I don't know if I can handle this, Laura admitted, her voice trembling. "I've spent my whole life waiting for this, and now that it's happening, I'm not sure I'm ready. It's not what I thought it would be." Emily listened patiently, then said, "You know, Laura, there's no such thing as perfection. The moment we start comparing ourselves to others is the moment we lose sight of what we're really doing. You've written a book that speaks to people. You've taken a huge risk, and that alone is something to be proud of. No matter how many negative reviews you get, they will never define your worth. Only you can do that." Laura paused, the weight of Emily's words sinking in. She had been so focused on the fear of judgment that she had forgotten why she started writing in the first place. It wasn't for praise, it wasn't for accolades, it was for herself. Writing had been her way of finding herself again, of discovering a voice she had buried for years. She had done it. She had achieved what many would never dare to. And that was enough. As the days went on, Laura started to shift her perspective. She realized that she couldn't control what others thought about her book. She couldn't change the reviews, nor could she please everyone. But what she could control was her own journey. And her journey wasn't about seeking validation from external sources. It was about embracing the courage it took to follow her passion, to take that first step into the unknown. The more she focused on that, the less the negative reviews seemed to matter. She began to find peace in the quiet moments, the moments when she wrote for herself, when she remembered why she had started. But there were still challenges. As Starting Over continued to gain traction, Laura found herself facing new expectations, expectations from readers, from the publisher, and from herself. The pressure to write another book, to replicate her success, loomed over her like a dark cloud. She was expected to keep producing, to keep delivering. And yet, amid the pressure, Laura found a new sense of clarity. She couldn't keep writing to please others. She couldn't live her life for anyone else. Her writing had to be a reflection of her own truth, her own journey, not a response to the expectations of the world around her. One afternoon, she sat down at her desk with a fresh cup of coffee. Her laptop was open, the cursor blinking in front of her. Instead of jumping into a new project with the weight of external pressure on her shoulders, she took a deep breath and began to write a letter to herself. Dear Laura, you've done something incredible. You've taken a leap of faith and let the world see who you are. No matter what comes next, remember why you started. It's not about the reviews, the success, or the recognition. It's about telling your story, living your truth, and finding your voice. Don't let anyone take that away from you. You are enough. When she finished the letter, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't about the next big thing, the next contract, or the next bestseller. It was about honoring the journey she had already taken and the person she had become along the way. And so, Laura turned her attention back to her writing. The pressure of external expectations still lingered, but it no longer had a hold on her. She was ready to write again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She had faced the changes that came with success, and now she was learning to embrace them, flaws and all. The book launch was behind her now, and the whirlwind of publicity, reviews, and interviews had settled into a quiet, yet fulfilling routine. For the first time in months, Laura felt as though she could breathe again. It wasn't the rush of success that thrilled her, it was the sense of knowing that she had made a choice to live her life on her terms, no longer bound by the expectations of others. As autumn settled into New York, Laura found herself walking through the city more often. The crisp air felt refreshing, and the vibrant colors of the falling leaves seemed to reflect the transformation she had gone through. She had made it through the storm of self-doubt, and now, she was beginning to see the beauty in what lay ahead. One evening, as she walked through Central Park, Laura found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. It was hard to believe that only a year ago, she had been sitting in an office, feeling suffocated by a career she had long outgrown. The leap she had taken was terrifying, but it had led her to this moment of quiet contentment. She had no regrets. Her thoughts turned to the future. What next? The question had nagged at her for some time. She had written Starting Over, and it had been a success. But now, the question loomed, could she write again? Could she write another novel that was just as meaningful, just as impactful? The pressure to keep the momentum going was real, but she knew that it was something she had to do on her own terms. She couldn't chase after the success of her first book, she had to focus on what her heart truly wanted to say. That evening, Laura sat down at her desk, the familiar glow of the laptop screen in front of her. She opened a new document, took a deep breath, and began to type. At first, the words didn't come as easily. The idea of writing something new was daunting. But as she wrote, she felt the same spark she had felt when she began her first novel. It wasn't about replicating her past success, it was about telling another story, one that had been waiting to be told. Her second novel would be different. It would be more personal, more introspective. It would explore themes of reinvention, healing, and the quiet strength that comes from embracing who you are, flaws and all. It would be about letting go of the past and moving forward, not because you have to, but because you want to. As the months passed, Laura's second book began to take shape. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when doubt crept in. But with every word she wrote, she grew stronger. She had learned that writing was not just about crafting a story, it was about confronting her own fears and uncertainties, about finding her voice in the chaos of the world. One afternoon, she received a letter from a reader. It was handwritten, which surprised her. As she read the letter, tears welled up in her eyes. The reader thanked her for writing Starting Over and shared their own story of personal transformation. They had been stuck in a job they hated, living a life they didn't want, but reading Laura's book had inspired them to make a change. They were now pursuing their own dreams, just as Laura had. The letter was simple, but its message was clear. Laura's words had made a difference. She had touched someone's life, and in that moment, she realized that was what it was all about. It wasn't about the fame, the success, or the accolades. It was about sharing her story and helping others find the courage to share theirs. As the final draft of her second book took shape, Laura felt a sense of peace. She had found her place in the world, and it wasn't in a corporate office or a predictable life. It was in the words she wrote, the stories she told, and the lives she touched along the way. She wasn't the same woman she had been a year ago, and she didn't want to be. She had embraced change, not just in her career, but in her life. And now, as she looked out the window at the sunset, she realized that the future was wide open, filled with endless possibilities. For the first time, Laura was no longer afraid. She was ready to face whatever came next, with courage, with passion, and with the confidence that no matter what, she was on the right path.